really pleased to be joined by three additional leaders from across Turtle Island for this really important discussion. I'm going to ask each of you to kindly do an introduction. I'm going to start with Valine, then Jess, then Itwa, if that's okay. So we'll start with you, Valine. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, Hawa for that. And before I introduce myself, I just need to take a moment, Lindsay, to express really deep and sincere gratitude for all that you just shared. That was very personal, and I acknowledge how open you were. And I've just witnessed a lot of strength and generosity in your presentation. So Hawa for that. And while I'm giving accolades to beautiful, strong Indigenous women, Itwa and Jess, my goodness, when I saw that you two were going to be here and that you would be fellow panelists, I said, sign me up. Absolutely. You are brilliant, powerful, and dedicated, influential moms, citizens in your nations and communities, and just incredibly honored to be here with you three. So Sangait La, good day. Valine Iskian Ais the Haanas Hinijdi. My names are Valine and Ais the Haanas, and I will introduce myself in the Circle way. So my days are spent with the Circle on Philanthropy, working with Chris Archie and her amazing growing team at the Circle. My job is to steward the summer season, and my title is Manager of Member Engagement and Accountability. I am a citizen of the Haida Nation. I belong with the Kawas Eagle clan, and my ancestral village is Kiusa, which is on the northwest corner of Haida Gwaii. And I very happily live on my motherland. I'm located today in Skagilda Ulnagai. As many Indigenous women hold different roles and responsibilities. So outside of the Circle, I am first and foremost an auntie. I have two little nibblings who are just the most precious little beings, and I carry very deeply my responsibility to them and my role as their aunt. I have been an advisor on the Vancouver Foundation level program, and now with their Indigenous Priorities program. And I am just so deeply honored to cross paths with Jess in many ways and work alongside her with the Council of Aunties on the Right Relations Collaborative. And I think I'll stop my introduction there and just appreciate you all. Hawa.
Yeah. Jess?
Yo. Hi, everyone. My name is Chiwagilao. My alias in English is Jess Hosty. I am speaking to you today from my unceded ancestral motherlands in Helsik territory on the outer central coast of what's colonially known as BC. I'm geographically not too far away from Valine, although I often wish it was closer. I am so honored to be here with all of you today, and so grateful for the time that you've taken out of your days to be in community with us for a little while. My day job is that I support land-based programming for youth and families in my nation through a small charitable nonprofit called Tux Project Society. I spent about 18 years doing fundraising and communications for the organization, and have been in an executive director role for the last 3 years. Through that work, I've, as anyone who's tried to resource community work knows, I've had to interact with a lot of folks in the funding community, and over the years, that has led to side bits of work to try to bring philanthropy into more values alignment with the way community work is happening, especially in rural and remote Indigenous communities and out on the land. And in doing that, I'm so thrilled that I get to hang out with Valine and Itwa and so many incredible Indigenous people, and primarily Indigenous women, who are just rocking it in making that change and doing things differently. That has manifested for me most recently in becoming the co-lead of a new space called the Right Relations Collaborative, which I will speak more about later, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm just really excited to do this work and to do it with incredible people, and to be here today to share a little bit with you. Kaya Sika.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. Itwa?
Dante. Intwan Skarensie, Licho Gotine Gotsvante, AIDS on Ditchina Gotine Gotsvante, Sambak in De. Hi everyone, my name is Intwan Skarens. I'm from the Quicho Nation. I come from the Tree Line people in the Northwest Territories, or Dene. And I live in Yellowknife in the NWT here. My history with philanthropy started many years ago, actually, as an intern at the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada when I was a student at U of T in Toronto. And then since then evolved, formally, I was the executive director of the Arctic Funders Collaborative, which is a network of philanthropic funders granting all over the circumpolar Arctic. And during my time there, I led development of the Arctic Indigenous Fund, which is an Indigenous led fund led by young Indigenous leaders from across the Arctic. And since then, since I left my role at the AFC the last 2 years, I've been doing consulting through my business. And so I do a lot of work and I try really to prioritize my time with my Indigenous, like Dene communities here in the Northwest Territories, but I do still stay involved in philanthropy and provide ongoing mentorship and support to the Arctic Indigenous Fund, and the people involved in that fund still have done a number of things throughout the years, working with different philanthropic organizations. I sit on the board of Inspire and on the editorial advisory committee for The Philanthropist. And I'm excited to dive into these conversations because I feel like this is a really important topic that we're bringing today, and really happy to do it alongside the three of you. Merci.
Noah, thank you so much. It was really great to hear each of your bios, where you're from, what you're bringing. It's really incredibly inspiring. So I'm very humbled and honored to be here with you, and really look forward to hearing from each of you in terms of what your experiences, thoughts, opinions, ideas, and change-making considerations are. So I'm going to start with Valine on question number 1. The first question asks, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission summary report was released 7 years ago this June. And since then, there's been lots of rhetoric around reconciliation, but very little action. Indigenous Watchdog, which monitors and reports on how reconciliation is advancing on the critical issues that are impacting the Indigenous world, including the progress on the TRC's calls to action, reveals that only 11 out of 94 calls have been completed. The term reconciliation itself has become contested, and I know the Circle has recently been intentional to move away from that language toward reciprocity. Can you tell us why that shift was needed?
Oh, yeah. How for that question, Lindsay. It's an apt question given the name of this webinar that we're a part of here tonight. And I will do my best to answer that question as a Haida citizen, as an Indigenous person, and specifically with my role at the Circle on Philanthropy. So that shift did kind of start before I joined the Circle. And so I think I would just start by saying that we are very actively, very consciously moving away from reconciliation and towards reciprocity, because generally, I appreciated in your presentation, you recognize the differences, the many ways that Indigenous peoples are, and the way that we, view the world. So I think that looking at it in terms of reciprocity better aligns with an Indigenous worldview. It certainly does as a Haida person. Reciprocity is, for me, embedded in our governing systems and in our social structures. It really carries like an action. It's a verb-based, we have a verb-based language. And so there are principles of abundance and generosity and collective benefit that I see embedded within reciprocity, and the way that we approach that versus reconciliation. As you said, it's considered kind of rhetoric. It's been co-opted. I think that there are a lot of issues with trust when it comes to language around reconciliation, what that means, and how specifically the federal government has used that term in the past several years. So the circle in 2018 at a convening that was hosted in Tloquet territory in what's called Tofino, really started to engage the network, talk with Indigenous peoples, talk with our Indigenous members. And that's really where we started to shift away from language of reconciliation, which is embedded in the philanthropic community's declaration of action. It is language that obviously we have used in the past. And it was just really important for us to look to Indigenous peoples, worldviews, and ways of being and language to see what would better fit within the work that we're doing in the sector as a whole. So the declaration that came together really quickly in, I think it was 2012, it came out just around the TRC calls to action that were released. Was kind of developed by the settler philanthropic community. And it really invited a lot of support. A lot of organizations endorsed it, signed on to it, and it moved people's hearts. And over the last couple of years, the Circle has been working really hard to develop programs and offerings that are focused on substantial movement in practice, policy, and grant making. That encourages funders to pay attention to power. And so that kind of action component is embedded in this flip from reconciliation to reciprocity. And to the Circle, reciprocity is a movement towards equity and justice. And so I'm going to share in the chat a link to the Partners in Reciprocity program that now has its second cohort. It's a program it's a year-long fellowship program that's being offered by the Circle on Philanthropy. And it's a really explicit way that we're supporting our members to be examining those power relationships and providing tools and support for the foundations to be in better relationship with Indigenous peoples and communities and organizations. So I'm going to pop that in the chat and just use that as one example of how we have been shifting our language and our intention and expectation towards reciprocity. Hawa.
Nyawa, thank you so much. That's, I think, really important for us to think about the ways in which language is changing and as directed by the way Indigenous folks are thinking about the words that we use. There's a friend of mine who often says, moving from rhetoric to reality. I think that's a pretty powerful statement. So connected to the shift in language, I'd also like to explore the concept of narrative sovereignty that's beginning to emerge in media and the arts, but has implications in philanthropy as well. Narrative sovereignty is all about the idea of reclaiming our stories and amplifying our voices. Within settler philanthropy, the story has always been about acts of charity and benevolence. In that story, supporting Indigenous organizations is a good thing to do. However, increasingly, there are calls to reimagining the role of philanthropy as it acts as an act of justice. In this way, supporting Indigenous organizations is not just good, but imperative. What are your thoughts on this particular topic? And I'll leave that open for anyone who'd like to speak to this.
I have some thoughts, if I can jump in.
You go ahead, Jess, and then I'll add to it.
Sure. So, I think that actually one of the most important ways that philanthropy can seed power and foster more just and equitable relationships is through a movement toward co-development of narratives and storytelling with Indigenous partners. That's not something that at least I have seen happen in a very authentic way very often. I think the language around benevolence is really deeply problematic. It perpetuates stereotypes. It's really harmful framing, especially given the fact that money in the bank is functionally useless as a tool for good until the moment when a community partner gives it some utility and incorporates it into transformative work that's happening on the ground. Money is not the inherent good. The work is what is good, and money, or the lack of it, is actually just a barrier. And it is a barrier that philanthropy can remove as a justice-seeking measure in the sector. And so, I think in that sense, the language and the framing matter a great deal. Benevolence is, just trying to stop myself from swearing. benevolence is nonsense. That's not the point. When we think about where the goodness is, where the inherent good is, it is in the work. And I think we need to reframe the way that we think about it so that we are coming together to support what is good. It is not about benevolence, raining sunshine down. It is about growing from the roots together.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. Itwa, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think the only thing I wanted to add, since we're talking so much about shifts in language, which I agree is really important, because in philanthropy in particular, we have such a focus on the language we use, and there's a long history of using language to describe Indigenous communities and, to tell our story in ways that doesn't suit us, and as Jess said, is nonsense. But I think it's also really important for foundations and funders to remember too that we also, I find in philanthropy, have a reputation for pointing to shifts in language as evidence that the hard work has been done, that the change has happened. But I think it's really important to stay focused on what you said, Lindsay, that it can't just be rhetoric. There has to be reality. And as Valine was saying, it needs to lead to action. And so, it's not enough to say, well, we're going to call, our grantees grant partners, because that's more indicative of a reciprocity, reciprocal relationship. But at the end of the day, what does the grant making actually look like, and how does that work get done, and who really holds the power and has that relationship, and the way decision making happens really changed? And if not, then changing, the terminology you use doesn't have a whole lot of impact to it. So I just wanted to add that. And the last thing I wanted to say too was that I think, the shift towards this being a just approach, it's not just a just approach, it's actually a really effective one. And so I think that's another framework of thinking for us to keep in mind, is that if you want to have an impact on supporting strong environmental stewardship, or supporting, language and culture, all those things, the work that our communities are doing is really amazing, strong work. And so investing in that is actually a really effective approach to, to meet those aligned interests and shared values.
No, thank you so much. Valine, did you want to add to this one? No, you're good. Okay. Jess, this next question is for you. It asks, so the Right Relations Collaborative is a bold new initiative that radically upends the conventional funder-grantee relationship. Can you share why it was established, and how the model that you have can be a guide for others to change or transform philanthropy?
Yeah, I love talking about this. Honestly, the Right Relations Collaborative, at least for me, was partly about manifesting a vision for an antidote to exhaustion and burnout. After nearly 2 decades of fundraising for Indigenous community work, I was burned out, and I am burned out. And for me, conventional philanthropy is a harmful thing in some ways that I have needed to heal from. It has, of course, enabled all kinds of really wonderful work, but a byproduct of having to do that work is that I am burned out. And, over a lot of years, I've been able to engage in conversations with lots of folks, primarily Indigenous women who are doing similar work in other rural and remote Indigenous communities. We're just talking about why fundraising, why philanthropy hits the way it does. And I've also, had the privilege of engaging in that conversation with some trusted funders who were really ready to see the harmful patterns in their sector and think about how they could do things differently. And those are conversations that have sort of always been happening in the background for me, but they just kept getting louder and louder and more frequent. And, one of the silver linings of COVID is that, we saw all of this emergency funding rolling out related to the pandemic, and it was being made available in low barrier ways, or at least lower barrier ways than we would normally see, which was wonderful and so necessary, and exactly the kinds of vehicles for giving that we'd been asking for, just reducing bureaucratic hoops people have to jump through around grant applications and reporting and timelines and all of the things. Like, we extended a lot of grace, or we saw a lot of grace being extended with this COVID emergency funding that was coming out. And as that was happening, it really felt like an important moment to seize and say, hey, as long as we're doing things differently, let's broaden the change and institutionalize the change, because I don't want to go back to the way things were before. And so for us, the Right Relations Collaborative is the model that has emerged out of that moment. It's a space that is governed by a council of aunties, including the brilliant Valine, all of whom are visionary women whom I really deeply admire and respect. They hold a vision for what good and right and just relations can look like between funder partners and Indigenous community organizations and leaders. So new Indigenous organizations and leaders who come into the space are doing that through a still emergent relational framework. And new funders who come into the space and put money into a pooled fund, they come to us through completing an engagement framework. And that engagement framework is kind of like a grant application in some ways. It asks them to dig into, what is your money story? Where are you at on your journey as a foundation toward more just relationships with Indigenous peoples, where you live, where you work, where you fund? How are you addressing colonial harms that you might be replicating in your philanthropic practices? It's a lot of deep questions that we ask people to reflect on. And those engagement frameworks, when they're completed, come back to the Council of Aunties. There's often rounds of questions that are brought back and forth with dialogue with these incoming funders. And when we are able to make a determination that a funder who's approached us is really values aligned and ready to do the work, then they're welcomed into the space too. And they are given the privilege of supporting this really incredible community work that's happening on the ground. And, it's heavy work and it's necessary work. People are at really different stages in their journeys of learning and unlearning all sorts of things. And so I think, the most important thing that I look for at the beginning of those relationships is values alignment, knowing that, we can do good work together if we have aligned values. And I want to share that, although I certainly had my anxieties in the early days about whether funders were going to want to be bold and do things differently and cede power and show up in really authentic and vulnerable ways, we're actually seeing a really genuine hunger amongst funders who are coming to us and initiating these conversations, which is really, really wonderful to see. And so although it's complex work, it's also actually inherently joyful and regenerative work too, seeing how these relationships deepen and how transformative support is being extended to brilliant community work when we're able to put the right conditions in place through the collaborative.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jess. That sounds like a tremendous, and I think probably really great opportunity to really turn the way we think about it on its head to restore balance and equality in those relationships. I think it's, I'm actually familiar with it. And some of the words that you shared spoke to me too during the pandemic funding experience. There was suddenly the red tape became looser in terms of the restrictions, and there was an openness and a willingness to be more sort of humane in the approach to funding. And it was truly transformative because we saw communities doing things that were unprecedented because there was no red tape attached. So just wanted to share that. So really tremendous work, Nyawa. The next question asks, over the past few years, there have been a number of Indigenous-led organizations emerge within philanthropy from the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, Arctic Indigenous Fund, the Circle on Philanthropy, and now the Right Relations Collaborative. These are all examples of Indigenous self-determination. Can you tell us why that's important and the critical gap these organizations are seeking to fill? Let's first hear from Itwa, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think Indigenous led funds really are a model, as Jess was describing before, that's about like co-development. It really puts the power over philanthropic resources into the hands of Indigenous people. And that's valuable because Indigenous people have the most knowledge about what goes on in their communities, what's needed, what's going to work for them in terms of how to mobilize resources. And so a lot of the factors for, I think, funders who are thinking about wanting to support Indigenous communities and, you know, mobilize their resources to have an impact there. What these Indigenous led funds do is actually like remove a lot of the risk. And the relationships between these Indigenous led funds and their own communities already exist. So it makes it a lot easier, I think, for funders to direct their resources in a way that makes more sense. So for me, I think like my experience in helping to lead the development of the Arctic Indigenous Fund, you know, not only is it a model that works, it also for me was filling a really critical gap in terms of like building leadership capacity and philanthropy amongst Indigenous people. When I started in philanthropy at the AFC, I was the only Indigenous person from the North working in philanthropy. And it was a very lonely space. And I like got burnt out because I was stretched so thin, trying to, you know, be out there, a voice for Northern Indigenous peoples in those spaces and make sure that, you know, our worldview is understood. But now with the Arctic Indigenous Fund, there's a whole advisory, I think there's 8 of them now, who, you know, we're all new to philanthropy, but now have a good understanding of what it is, but also how to lead in it. And it just has like a ripple effect because they have an understanding of philanthropy where most people in the North have no idea what the heck philanthropy is. It makes like more philanthropic resources, not just the resources from the Arctic Indigenous Fund, more accessible to our communities. And so it just has like these whole ripple effects of goodness, I find, because we're building the amount of Indigenous leadership that present in philanthropy. And I think if we're going to keep moving in philanthropy as a sector towards reciprocity, we need more Indigenous leadership. So the handful of us who are already here in this space don't continue to get burnt out.
Yeah, well, thank you. Valine, can I ask what your thoughts are on this?
Oh, sure. Yes. How I just everything that Itawa just said. It's difficult for me to add anything, but I can absolutely echo and say that my experience with Indigenous-led collaboratives is really through the Right Relations Collaborative, through the Aunties Council and the engagement framework that we've developed together. And it has been a really meaningful, powerful, and overdue flipping of power and ensuring that the right people are making decisions about where support goes. We're the people in community. We know what our territories need. We know how to be responsive. We know how to have relational and trust-based, approaches to philanthropy. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge the many ways that Indigenous peoples have demonstrated philanthropic behaviors and what that means. That's beyond a financial transaction. I think exactly what Itawa said, and we're creating networks, we're investing in other leaders, and we're able to see like real and meaningful transformation happening in communities when you entrust Indigenous peoples to make decisions about where support is going and how it's reaching people and when, and being able to reduce those barriers and increase kind of the rapidness and again the trust that's I think embedded within Indigenous-led collaborations. Hawa.
Noah, thank you. This next question is for Itawa. Supporting Indigenous communities has become an emerging priority across. Ooh, is this the same question? Sorry, I actually wear glasses and I think I need to put them on because I'm trying to go between 2 screens to see you all. Did I just ask this one or is it a different one? I'm trying to highlight them so they're not the same. Nope, it's a different one. All right, back to you, Itawa. Supporting Indigenous communities has become an emerging priority across the philanthropic sector. But we know historically very little of that money has actually gone to communities directly. For example, a study released last year found that Indigenous organizations only receive 0.5% of all funds granted by foundations across Canada. Can you speak to why you believe this funding disparity exists?
Yeah, I mean, you gave an excellent presentation, comprehensive overview of, you know, a lot of the factors that contributed to, basically systemic racism. And philanthropy as a sector really is built as an institution that was meant to perpetuate like oppression of marginalized people, including Indigenous peoples. So, I mean, we have that as I think a history and foundation as a sector. And so we have a lot of work to do in sort of changing the power dynamics in philanthropy and the way that resources flow. And we've made, I think, we've made strong progress even in, I would say, the last 5 years. I'm always amazed how quickly things have changed, but at the same time, there's still so much work left to do. You know, when I started at the AFC, there was a lot of organizations in the North receiving funds to do work in Indigenous communities, and they were non-Indigenous organizations. And so we're having conversations about like, why is that money not going directly to Indigenous communities? And there's often, I think, a bit of like, honestly, just fear about doing direct granting to Indigenous communities because people don't have the relationships with our communities. There's like that, I think, like racist rhetoric about Indigenous communities not being capable of managing finances and, you know, that kind of crap, which is absolutely not the case. Like, we have a lot of capacity in our community. So I think that's sort of ongoing sort of shifts and changes that need to happen. I think now we're starting to see a lot more direct granting to Indigenous communities, which is great. It's nice to see that change. And I think for the funders who are, you know, not in a position yet to maybe do that direct granting to a community itself, investing in Indigenous led funds is an excellent solution to that, because as we said before, we already have those relationships on the ground. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that factored into that disparity. So I'll just leave it at that, and hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. This next question, Valine, is actually for you. Earlier this year, the Circle released the, and correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly, is it the I4DM? Sort of the, yeah, did you want to maybe spell that out before I go with the rest of the question? No, we'll come back to it. Okay, cool. So the Circle released, which sought to define the power of relationships in settler philanthropy and to make distinctions between programs and organizations that are truly Indigenous led and those that believe, or those that simply benefit Indigenous communities but have little input from them. Can you tell us why developing this model was so needed?
Yes, I can definitely do that. And it's the perfect segue, because what just leapt out at me that you just shared, Eat, was just the reality, the really harsh reality of how many non-Indigenous organizations, so settler-based organizations that are doing work within Indigenous communities or in service to Indigenous communities, are receiving grant funds that can and should be dedicated to Indigenous-led organizations. So the beginning of the I4DM absolutely predates my time with the Circle. The DM stands for Definitional Matrix. So the Definitional Matrix was released 6 years ago in 2016. And after that was put out into the world, some of you may be familiar with it. It no longer exists on our website, so don't go looking for it, because what's absolutely taken its place is the I4DM. But we spent a couple of years organizationally looking at that tool and reflecting on it and asking ourselves how it could be used to add value to Indigenous-led organizations, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous nations, and how the framework can be used to change practice and policy within settler philanthropic grant-making practices and partnerships. So we embarked on updating it. What became the I4DM is now available on our website. I'll pop a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in looking that up. It is a matrix that helps organizations to identify where they are on a spectrum from Indigenous benefiting. So those are organizations who are, providing some service or benefit to Indigenous organizations, to Indigenous led organizations. And so it can be used as a guidepost for conversation, and it can be used as a tool both for Indigenous organizations to kind of, use that as a way to demonstrate where they are on that spectrum, if they're Indigenous benefiting or if they're Indigenous led. And it's also a tool for grant makers to really look at and understand who they're funding, and maybe ask themselves, why they're funding who they are. So obviously the Circle works today to uplift Indigenous sovereignty, and we're big advocates for and prioritize Indigenous-led organizations. And we like to elevate Indigenous-led work and collaborations and movements, and really advocate for funding to reach Indigenous-led work abundantly and without restriction and quickly. So I'm going to pop in the chat again, the I4DM. Along with that, now on our website is a set of terms of use. It's just a couple of pages, and it's really in the spirit of reciprocity and accountability and integrity that we have these couple of pages to provide context to the I4DM and set some expectations around how it can be used by other organizations in its full form, making sure that everyone's reading the preamble, the history, and working through the various questions that we offer for reflection and conversation in the I4DM. Hala.
Noah, thank you so much. That sounds amazing. Folks who are viewing this evening, kindly be reminded to look at the bottom of your screen for the Q&A section. The Q&A is live. You can enter your questions for our speakers this evening if you have them. And the links to the resources that are being shared are being populated in the chat. Noah. Okay, the next question, and I'm going to maybe start with you, Jess, on this one. In many instances, donors, funders who have an interest in building relationships with Indigenous communities don't appreciate the unique characteristics of our organizations. How would you describe those nuances, and what are some effective ways allies can support with this work?
Yeah, Jessica. I think the simplest place to start is by recognizing that you don't know everything, and that's okay. I think that folks are often really, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the ravens dancing on my roof. I think folks are often really uncomfortable saying, I don't know, please teach me. And admitting that they're coming often from a place of ignorance, or not having had opportunities to learn about these nuances. But let's get real about it. I think if we can start from a place of recognizing that this work that we're doing in community as Indigenous people is complex and nuanced, I would ask our funder partners to also recognize that they're not the experts on Indigenous organizations and community work, but they're in partnership and in community with the experts who are their grantees. Be willing to get vulnerable about that. And, I feel like I am so blessed to be steeped in an understanding of what my community is asking for, because I live and work in my community. I've had the opportunity to build buy-in and trust. I've shown up, I've done the work, I continue to do the work, and my community holds me accountable to do that work for them, which is a really beautiful thing. And I think that you don't need to look to a consultant or a think tank or anything external to community to understand how community organizations work. Like, your grantees know what's up. Valine, also Gayasika, shared the Right Relations Collaborative's engagement framework in the chat. And that is the tool that we use to invite potential funders to do some deep reflection. And even if you're not interested in Right Relations Collaborative in particular, I think the questions in the framework are really valuable starting places for all foundations in so-called Canada to really start to reflect on how they show up in relation to their Indigenous grantees. Your grantees may not feel that they are in a position of power to ask you these questions. And so it is important for you to level the playing field by doing that work yourself and being prepared to share it. And above all, I think one big piece that I would just always ask people to extend more grace around is adjusting timelines. Your timelines for everything. things will happen at the pace of trust when it comes to working in and with and for Indigenous communities. And you have to give that trust time and space to develop, and you have to nurture it. It's hard work, and it's not always clear work, but you are doing it in community with incredible people who are the experts in what their people need. So recognize that for the asset that it is, and uphold that expertise, and don't be afraid to be vulnerable and deepening your relationships with them.
Yeah, well, that's great advice. I appreciate that. Itwa, did you want to add to this one? How can folks build better relationships?
I think having openness to doing things differently is really important. You know, the sort of Western approach to philanthropy is one that generally doesn't work well for us. You know, it uses language we don't understand. It has all kinds of barriers based on, I think, a totally different worldview in terms of what success is and what's important and like what accountability means. So, you know, as we shift, you know, towards supporting more Indigenous leadership, there's opportunity for more funders to really, I think, reflect on the way they do things and, you know, perhaps consider that there is other ways of doing things, and maybe those other ways might be more effective for the populations that they're trying to serve. And I think going back to that question about why a funding disparity does exist amongst Indigenous communities, that's a really big part of it, because there is a long history of creating far too many hoops to jump through to access really small amounts of money. And that just doesn't make sense. So I would just say, like, keep an openness. And, you know, it's really interesting to see through COVID, because for so long we heard in philanthropy that, you know, about the inflexibility to change things. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, and all of a sudden there was like a really amazing ways where all of a sudden things could be done differently, where maybe reporting didn't need to happen the way it's always been done with these big long written reports that were quite onerous, but maybe it could just be a phone call. So I think COVID really forced us to see that like adaptation is possible. And so perhaps we can continue to evolve the way we do things as a sector.
No, I would echo that. I'm hopeful for that future as well. I think we all are. So that's exciting. Valine, did you want to add to this too in terms of any tips for relationships? No? Okay. All right. Many organizations now are embracing calls for equity and prioritizing equity-seeking groups. In this way, Indigenous groups are often folded into broader initiatives targeting BIPOC communities. But Indigenous people in this country aren't calling for equity. We want self-determination and sovereignty. Why is this such an important distinction to make? And why must funders specifically address Indigenous communities separate from other marginalized groups? What thoughts, if any, do folks have on this subject matter? Any thoughts from our speakers? Do you see Indigenous folks as sort of falling into equity as a category? Do you think that's where Indigenous folks perhaps need to be in the minds of equity, diversity discourse that's happening in different spaces across the country?
I mean, I think there is a place and a space for Indigenous people in those conversations, but that is not the only space where we need to be. I think that marginalized and oppressed groups have a lot in common with each other in terms of the tactics that are used against us to create inequities and marginalize folks. And so in a lot of senses, there is really deep solidarity across BIPOC groups, including Indigenous groups. And that is important solidarity to constantly put in action. But there are absolutely issues and inequities that are unique to Indigenous people that need to be addressed on their own, in the same way that there are issues that are unique to our Black brothers and sisters and other people of color. So I think there's a time and a place for general conversations about equity-seeking groups and BIPOC groups. And there's also a time and a place to get real about the fact that we have to address the very specific harms and inequities that are being perpetrated across those individual groups.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jess. Does anyone else want to add to that question? Okay, if not, I think we're ready to take it to the chat. That concludes the main questions for this evening's events. Regrettably, we were doing a pre-briefing and I was instructed on what to do when it got to the end, but I wasn't listening. So Sharon, is this the part where you come back or do I keep going?
I think you take now some audience questions, Lindsay, and I think Claire has probably sent them to you. There's some good ones in there.
All right, great. I can see from the Q&A, there are two questions. The first one is, what does it mean to support Indigenous collaboratives in being sustainable in their work? What does it mean to support Indigenous collaboratives in being resilient? Does anyone want to take an attempt at that question? So sustainable in your work and resilient for Indigenous collaboratives.
I can share a little bit from the work that I did for IFIP for the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. In 2020, I partnered with IFIP to produce a landscape scan report on Indigenous led funds, which actually I'll share in the chat because there's some really great information in there and it's right from the source, from Indigenous led organizations themselves. So I'll put the link in there. But when we were doing that, we were kind of just trying to get a sense of some of the Indigenous led funds that are out there in the world. And we're pleasantly surprised to discover like there's quite a few and they for sure are not all captured in this report. There's many missing. But one of the things I heard as I was talking to these different Indigenous led funds was some like really, really clear messages from them about what they need from the philanthropic sector, what they need from the funding community and to be sustainable. And so we ended up adding a section that were their calls to action to support Indigenous led philanthropy. So I'll just go really quickly what they were. One is obviously investing in Indigenous led funds and like investing big money. Like, you know, these are really robust organizations that are really strong. So like they need the big grants and they have the capacity to manage them. So, you know, give them the big dollars. Support networking because Indigenous led funds learn so much from each other and from other Indigenous leaders in philanthropy. And so that knowledge sharing and mentorship is really key. And, you know, Valine and Jess and I were just together in Haida just a few weeks ago. And that's a prime example. Like that's really nourishing for us as Indigenous people to be in a space where we can share with each other. They said they need more platforms to share their own stories. We've talked about like narrative sovereignty today, and they want to tell their stories and they need access to the spaces to do that because there's a lot of closed doors in philanthropy still. An increase for Indigenous leadership. So we need more Indigenous people leading in philanthropy. We need more Indigenous people within foundations, on staff, on boards, and other decision-making bodies. Decolonize their practices. So really do the hard work to think about how you're decolonizing as an institution and also as an individual, because as you said, Lindsay, like systems are built by people. Give space to heal. As Indigenous people, we carry like quite the heavy load on philanthropy. And so they said like, we actually just need space to come together and heal together, which again is like the sort of privilege that we had hosted by the Circle a few weeks back in Haida was to do exactly that. Relinquish power, so make space for the power of Indigenous people to have power over the world's resources. And trust Indigenous led funds. The work that they're doing is really effective means for granting in Indigenous communities and doing Indigenous focused work. And then the last was change the narrative that investing in Indigenous re-granting models and Indigenous led funds are really responsible investments. They're investments in institutional capacity. Whereas previously, you know, in philanthropy, we have a tendency to think of that as high overhead, but investing in Indigenous leadership means that you're not just investing in people to administer grants and do these financial transactions, but you're investing in people who are literally leading the work to transform a sector. And so like really think about shifting that narrative, I think, is important. So those were sort of like the 9 sort of calls for support that I really heard from Indigenous led funds. And so I shared the link in the chat for anyone who wants to revisit those.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to take an attempt at answering the question? Valine, I see you nodding. Yeah?
Yeah, yes, Hawa. And Itwa, I'm so glad that you brought up that report and shared the link in the chat, because when I joined the circle just over a year ago, that was one of the first resources that I was, kind of given to orient myself to the sector. And it's a beautiful, thoughtful, very relevant piece of work. And so just really acknowledge your contributions to that. And I learned a lot. I still reference back to it. I think that the piece around platforms, I did want to share that we need access to, share our own stories, to tell the work that we're doing in community and in our territories. And that is very excitingly one of my priority projects with the circle in the next few months. So later this summer, we're going to launch a website that is going to be a platform. It's a hub to celebrate Indigenous organizations by sharing quality, authentic stories about organizational origins, purposes, and priorities, and profile and highlight the people who are doing that work in their community and in their territories. So I'm really excited to be able to share that and kind of connect it to this piece that Indigenous peoples and organizations have been saying is a need for us to be able to share the work that we're doing, why we're doing it, what our values are. And so for Indigenous organizations, it will be, a website kind of by us, for us. And it will be an invitation for funders and donors to also come and quickly see by geographic region, by priority area, whatever it is, and access and have a clear pathway to contribute to Indigenous-led organizations. So that was one thing that came to mind and I wanted to share. And also the term that kind of came top of mind in this question is generational funding. So we have an advisory group that's related to a climate commitment pledge. I'm not sure if those of you who are here are familiar with the philanthropic commitment on climate change, but it is something that the circle is involved with, and we have an advisory group. And first and foremost, absolutely what they came to the table and said is, if you want to talk about sustainability, if you want to talk about real and meaningful impact, we need to talk about generational funding so that we can focus on the work that we're doing in our communities and that we're mandated to do by our nations and communities. So generational funding is absolutely a way that we can talk about being sustainable in the work and supporting Indigenous collaboratives.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's great advice. Jess, did you want to add anything?
That was all just brilliant.
All right, great. So the next question is, can individual funders be part of the Right Relations Collaborative? Jess, I think that question was for you. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. So at this point, the majority of folks who sort of put up their hand and said, we want to engage in this process with you, have been different types of foundations. We have been approached by some corporate philanthropic folks. But I think we do have precedent for chatting with, individuals who want to put their wealth somewhere good and powerful and do it in a way that is in good relationship. And I would absolutely welcome anyone who's interested in learning more about that, or just wanting to do a fit check about whether this is a good thing for them, to reach out to me, and I'm very happy to chat.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, I think we're pretty close to time. I just want to acknowledge and extend my sincere gratitude to Toronto Foundation, to all of the amazing leaders I had the good fortune of sitting with this evening, to all of the audience members who came out and who listened and who opened their hearts and minds and were willing to learn. I really hope this has been a valuable experience for everyone involved. And thank you so much. And Sharon, with that, I will turn the final remarks of the evening over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Thank you so much. There is nothing better than an evening spent with great women. I'll just say that. And particularly, Lindsay, so lovely to see an extra guest visit you tonight, and recognizing how special it is that you gave us a couple of hours this evening for this discussion, and knowing that means maybe a little bit less time with your little man. So much gratitude to Valine, Itwa, Jess, and Lindsay for taking the time to expand our knowledge and deepen our understanding of reconciliation and reciprocity, both here and in other parts of this land. There is a lot to reflect on, including changing power dynamics, building and deepening relationships, and indeed, reimagining philanthropy. So because the chat is open, I am wondering if folks are comfortable sharing some of the reflections on what has most resonated for you in this session. I think it's really important to pause here and just think about, what are you taking away from what you heard today from these amazing women. I will share mine while you are putting yours in the chat. I think for me, earlier in Lindsay's description around pre-contact communities, and the idea of children and culture being at the heart of those communities, and how many things we did to destroy those two core values and beliefs. I think, practically speaking, I really love the definitional matrix from the circle that was shared in the chat. The questions are powerful and important, and it doesn't matter if you're a funder or a donor, an individual or a corporation. I think that we should all be asking those questions. Another thing that spoke to me was the comment from Lindsay, and I think repeated later by our panelists, that systems are built by people. And it struck me because we talk a lot in this sector, especially as a funder, about systems change. But absolutely, the truth is that systems come down to who's running them and who's creating them. And I think that's an idea I'm going to take away and think a lot about. So as you reflect on this conversation, what is resonating for you, folks? Claire, I see this idea of moving from multi-year funding to generational funding. I agree. And I was actually reflecting as well on the idea that, and maybe I should have asked our panelists this question, climate, is our gifts to climate also commitments to Indigenous culture? Naveen, I see reframing philanthropy to move away from benevolence to justice, that money has no power until it is in the hands of those who do the good work. It's so well said and so important. Things that will happen at the pace of trust. Janine, thank you. And yes, actually, in fact, one of our colleagues was saying that behind the scenes today, it's definitely a new mantra. The power shift towards inviting funders to apply, to be involved, and only accepting when values align. I love that, Susan. And Dina, accountability, resources for funders, and deeper insight into how best to serve community-led work. And I think we all appreciated that language in terms of the shift from reconciliation to reciprocity, and going deep on what that really means. And yes, Mike, as someone who's deeply action-oriented myself, the move from rhetoric to reality is really, really important. So thank you for all of those reflections, and certainly keep sharing them. So thank you again to our speakers. We also hope this conversation has inspired you to continue learning and reflecting, and also, as I said, to more action. What do we mean by that? You heard some suggestions from folks today, but this is a personal journey, and it's one we each have to individually own. This is not a journey to take to our Indigenous colleagues and ask them to solve our problems. We must do this work ourselves. And so It starts with sessions like this one, leaning into the learning, including understanding more about what reciprocity really means. It means researching organizations doing the work to support their communities to thrive, and learn about who leads the organization, who decides and designs and delivers the programming, and for whom. Ask those questions. It's about listening first. This was one of the reasons we didn't activate the chat off the top. This is first and foremost a listening exercise and allowing relationship to develop, to consider offering to share knowledge and skills or connections in ways that are agreed upon and helpful. It's about volunteering and focusing on building authentic and strong relationships. You heard our panel tonight talk about the fact that it isn't about money first. Money is important, don't get me wrong, and we want you to support these organizations financially, but we also want you to get into other kinds of relationship with them. Follow the issues and Indigenous-led orgs, access new media, support advocacy, and amplify the voices of Indigenous leaders. You can also consider extending your impact beyond the above by supporting equity-driven Indigenous businesses and social enterprises. You could consider responsible investing strategies. In fact, I'm going to give you a few ideas in a minute. If you're in the sector, absolutely consider joining the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. They're clearly leading the way and helping us all do better in this space. For our part at Toronto Foundation, we've been taking steps over the last 5 years that include obviously developing in relationships with local and nationally focused Indigenous organizations, but also through an incredible increase in our granting last year, supporting 23 Indigenous-led and serving organizations across the city. We've made social impact investments in the Raven Capital Indigenous Fund, which provides venture capital to Indigenous-owned businesses. We have a new investment in the Canadian Canoe Museum in partnership with a number of community foundations across the country, where reconciliation is a significant part of the mandate of this evolving organization. We've supported the launch of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, and we participate in its learning platform. And I'm very proud to be at the table for the Takaranto Indigenous Prosperity Table, hosted here by the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council. And most recently, actually, we have great news that we are very proud, actually humbled by the fact that we were chosen by the Anauma Foundation, which is the newest community foundation in the family. It's up in Nunavut. It is Indigenous-led and serving, and we will be their investment pooling partner, helping them get off the ground over the next few years, and just so proud to be able to support our colleagues in Nunavut. So we're coming to the end of our evening, and I'm so thrilled we're able to respect your time. We're going to end just before 9. We will be sending a follow-up email with additional resources to support your ongoing learning. We've just posted a link in the chat to a feedback survey, which we will also send to you after this session in the email. Please take a few minutes to do this as soon as you log off, as we really want to know your thoughts on this session, and your feedback ensures we get better and better at delivering our learning events. Thank you so much to everyone for coming, and again to our incredible speakers. As we always say, there is so much to learn, and it's so much more fun learning in community together. Be well, everyone. Good night.